The clock read 8:42 a.m. when Kendrick Robinson eased his car into a spot outside the municipal courthouse in Greenville, South Carolina. The golden sunlight of the early morning stretched long shadows across the asphalt, painting the world in hues of warmth. He breathed in deeply, his chest tight as he released the air in a long exhale. Being late was never a good thing. Not for him. As a federal prosecutor, every minute of his life was shaped by precision and punctuality. Discipline was his backbone, preparedness his foundation. Yet today, the universe had conspired against him. This wasn't supposed to be a complicated morning. The case was mundane, almost laughably so, challenging an error in a property tax adjustment on the house his grandmother had left him. The city had inexplicably raised the taxes on the home, and Kendrick had spent weeks gathering every shred of evidence to prove the mistake. The house wasn't just a piece of property. It was the foundation of his childhood, a silent witness to his growth, the place where lessons of right and wrong were taught under his grandmother's watchful eye. Dressed in a dark navy suit and a crisp white shirt, Kendrick looked every bit the seasoned attorney he was, even if his morning had been far from flawless. An urgent phone call had delayed him. Something about a last-minute motion filed by the defense in a human trafficking case. He couldn't afford to ignore it. He'd reviewed the motion, provided feedback, and hurried out the door, knowing time was running short. As he reached the courthouse steps, his phone buzzed. A quick glance revealed a message from his assistant at the U.S. Attorney's office. The judge in Greenville has a reputation for being tough on latecomers. Be careful. Kendrick sighed and tucked the phone back into his briefcase, shrugging off the message. He had facts. He had evidence. He wasn't worried. But something in that message lingered, scratching at the back of his mind. He dismissed it as he stepped into the courthouse's cool interior. The municipal court was nothing like the sleek, imposing federal courts where Kendrick typically worked. The walls were a tired beige, the seats worn and scuffed from decades of use. The air smelled faintly of coffee, old paper, and something else, perhaps history. Despite its worn appearance, the place was alive with movement. People shuffled in and out, clutching stacks of documents, their faces etched with anxiety over parking tickets, minor disputes, and small claims. Kendrick checked his watch. 8:50 a.m. 10 minutes to spare. Just enough time to find the right courtroom. He followed the signs down a narrow hallway, passing hushed conversations as he moved. Room 204. He saw the brass lettering, Judge Charles Whitman, and adjusted his tie before stepping inside. The courtroom was already filling up. Kendrick found a spot near the back and sat down, flipping open his folder to review his evidence one last time. His eyes scanned the pages, his mind sharp despite the rush. As he reviewed his notes, he noticed the judge entering the room. A tall man with silver hair and piercing blue eyes. Judge Whitman commanded attention without a word, his gaze sweeping across the room with the authority of someone who had seen it all. His reputation for being a no-nonsense figure was evident in the way his eyes scanned each person, taking them in, missing nothing. All rise, the bailiff called, and the room stood in unison. Kendrick's back straightened as he joined the others, the weight of anticipation settling over him. The judge took his seat, and the silence that followed was thick. With mechanical precision, Judge Whitman began calling cases, his tone crisp, detached, as if each person before him were no more than a blip in his day. Kendrick watched, observing closely. A middle-aged man in a suit shuffled in late, unnoticed. A young woman in casual clothes slipped in a few minutes after, taking a seat without a second glance from the judge. Kendrick made a mental note, but remained focused on his own case. At 9:15 a.m., his name was called. He stood, gathering his folder, and made his way to the podium. His steps were measured, his calm projecting outward, though the slight delay was gnawing at him. As he approached the podium, Judge Whitman's eyes lifted. Kendrick felt the shift in the air, the subtle tension that now crackled in the room. The judge's gaze hardened. "You're late, Mr. Robinson," Judge Whitman said sharply. His voice cut through the stillness, every word like a reprimand. "Do you think the court's time is less valuable than your own?" Kendrick raised his hand slightly, palms out, acknowledging the judge's words with respect. "Your Honor, I apologize for the delay. I was attending to urgent federal matters." The judge cut him off before he could finish. "Excuses don't excuse tardiness. This court operates on order and respect. If you can't follow that, I suggest you reevaluate your priorities." Kendrick felt the weight of the room's gaze. Dozens of eyes were on him, the collective scrutiny almost tangible. He held his composure, choosing his next words carefully. "Your Honor, I understand the importance of timeliness. If I may, I'd like to present my case regarding the property tax adjustment." The judge waved a hand dismissively. We'll get to that. First, there's the matter of contempt. Tardiness undermines the integrity of these proceedings. His gavel struck the air with finality. You are hereby fined $750. The words hung in the air like the strike of a hammer against an anvil. Kendrick's jaw tightened, but his expression remained neutral. Murmurs rippled through the room. He couldn't let this slide. Not after what he'd just witnessed. Your Honor, Kendrick began, his voice calm but firm. May I explain? The judge raised his gavel again, silencing him with a sharp, you may not. Consider this a lesson in respecting the court. Kendrick took a step back, his mind already calculating. This wasn't just about being late anymore. This was about something deeper. Something systemic. Something he couldn't ignore. He glanced briefly at the other latecomers. The man in the gray blazer, the young woman who had slipped in before him. Neither of whom had received so much as a glance from the judge. The disparity was glaring. Kendrick wasn't about to let it slide. As he returned to his seat, he opened his folder. But this time, it wasn't the tax documents he focused on. His pen flew across the page as he jotted down notes, his mind working with precision. The judge continued with the next case, his voice unwavering. Kendrick knew this morning was far from over. The room buzzed, but in his mind, a plan was already forming. He wasn't done, not by a long shot. The courtroom moved in its steady rhythm, but Kendrick couldn't shake the feeling that something more was at play here. He replayed the moment, the judge's harsh fine, the other's quiet disregard. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was a pattern. Kendrick knew it, as well as he knew the law. As the session continued, he took another slow breath. Then with measured resolve he stood once more. His name rang out again, and he walked to the podium with a deliberate calm stride. Your Honor, he began. I have here documentation regarding the erroneous property tax adjustment. He placed the folder in front of him, opening it to reveal the neatly organized papers and photographs. His fingers hovered over a page. This shows the original tax assessment, which remained consistent for 5 years. The new adjustment reflects a 30% increase without proper notification or explanation. Judge Whitman leaned back, exuding a practiced disinterest. I'll review it in due time. Mr. Robinson, however, your tardiness this morning is a matter we cannot overlook. Do you truly believe that the urgency of your federal responsibilities justifies disrespecting this court? Kendrick's composure remained unshaken. Your Honor, I mean no disrespect. My delay was due to a federal case involving human trafficking, a matter I believe we can all agree requires immediate attention. The judge's gaze narrowed, but his tone didn't waver. Your priorities, however noble, do not excuse breaking the rules. Court procedures exist for a reason. It wasn't just the judge's words that struck Kendrick. It was the unspoken dismissal, the implied message that his efforts, his achievements, his respect for the system, it all meant nothing in this room. Kendrick took a steady breath. Your Honor, he began, I understand the importance of rules. However, I must ask, are these rules applied equally to everyone in this courtroom? A ripple of unease passed through the room. The judge stiffened, his face flushing. Are you questioning the integrity of this court, Mr. Robinson? Kendrick's response was calm, measured. I'm asking for clarity. It's important to ensure that fairness is upheld, not just for myself, but for everyone here. The judge's gavel came down hard. I will not tolerate accusations against this court. Your fine stands. Kendrick inclined his head slightly, offering no protest. Thank you, Your Honor. He returned to his seat, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. The weight of the room was heavy now, the silence thick. Kendrick knew he wasn't just battling over property taxes anymore. This was something larger, something structural, something systemic. He pulled out his phone, typing quickly, making mental notes. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. When the session finally ended, Kendrick lingered. The room emptied slowly, but he stayed behind, observing. A young law student in the corner scribbled furiously in her notebook. Kendrick knew she was watching, absorbing the lessons of the day. As he left the courtroom, he glanced back one final time. He wasn't leaving empty-handed. He had something bigger to take away. The fight had only just begun. By the next morning, Kendrick's phone buzzed sharply, dragging him from his thoughts. It was the U.S. Attorney's office. He recognized the number immediately. Julia Harper. The voice on the other end was one he knew well. Strong, confident, and cutting through the air with the urgency of someone who'd seen it all before. Kendrick, she began, her tone a mix of authority and curiosity. I read your report. If what you're describing is accurate, this isn't just an isolated incident. There was a pause, and Kendrick could almost feel the weight of her words. This could point to something bigger, Something systemic, she continued, the words hanging in the air. Kendrick didn't hesitate. I believe it does, he said, his voice steady. What happened yesterday wasn't a one-off. It's part of a pattern, something I've seen time and time again. I'm certain I'm not the only one who's noticed it. Julia exhaled sharply, a sound that spoke volumes. I'll reach out to the Judicial Review Commission, she said. We need to handle this carefully, thoroughly. In the meantime, gather everything. All the documentation you can find. If this leaks, we need to be ready. The call ended, but Kendrick knew his real work had just begun. His hands moved quickly, pulling records from the municipal court case, piecing together the scraps of evidence from the session. He combed through public files, checking for discrepancies, fines and penalties that didn't add up. And then the pattern started to emerge. Black defendants were fined significantly higher than their white counterparts for seemingly minor infractions, while white defendants often walked away with just a warning or reduced penalties. The deeper he dug, the clearer it became. He reached out to colleagues, to members of the community, to attorneys who'd worked in Judge Whitman's courtroom. The responses flooded in. Some whispered in hushed tones. Others shouted out with an audacity Kendrick had never expected. One young black woman described how she'd been fined heavily for a simple parking violation, while a white man with multiple offenses had only received a small fee. Another defendant spoke of being cut off mid-sentence, unable to explain himself fully, as the judge bulldozed him in front of the court. The more he uncovered, the clearer it became that this was not an isolated issue. Days passed, and the Judicial Review Commission moved quickly. Investigators swarmed the courthouse, requesting case records from years past, and speaking to anyone who might shed light on the truth. Mrs. Thompson, the court clerk, became a key witness. Nervously, she handed over a small, worn notebook, hidden in her desk drawer for years. These are my notes, she said in a whisper, as if afraid of being overheard. Every time something didn't feel right, I wrote it down. I was too scared to speak out before. But I can't stay silent anymore. The notebook was damning, dates, names, and instances of unequal treatment, carefully recorded over time. But it wasn't just the clerk who spoke up. James Wilson, the longtime bailiff, shared his perspective with quiet conviction. I've been here for 15 years, Wilson said, his voice steady but tinged with regret. I've seen how the judge treats people differently depending on who they are. I always knew it wasn't right, but I didn't think there was anything I could do. The story began to leak to the public. A young law student who had witnessed one of the court sessions took to social media, sharing a detailed account of what he'd seen. The post spread like wildfire. Within hours, it had garnered thousands of likes and comments, each echoing the same message: this wasn't right. More testimonies came in, each adding fuel to the fire. Headlines began to flash across every news outlet. Bias in Greenville courtroom. Federal prosecutor challenges judge's conduct. The public was outraged, and Kendrick found himself thrust into the eye of the storm. The calls from reporters came in nonstop, but Kendrick kept his focus on the investigation. He wasn't swayed by the media frenzy. There was too much at stake. And as the weeks passed, the pressure on Judge Whitman mounted. Rumors began circulating that he'd been summoned to several closed-door meetings with judicial oversight committees. Though he denied any wrongdoing publicly, the walls were closing in. By the end of the first week, Kendrick received another call from Julia. The numbers don't lie, Kendrick, she said. Black defendants in that courtroom were fined 3 times more than white defendants for the same offenses. It's systemic. We need to take this to the state judicial board. Kendrick's heart sank as he absorbed the gravity of her words. What's the next step, he asked. We're going public with this, she replied. The media is already on it. Be ready. Kendrick nodded grimly, a sense of exhaustion creeping in. This was bigger than he had imagined. But he wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. The case began to snowball, and by the second week, national outlets had picked it up. The story dominated the news cycle. Systemic bias unveiled. Federal prosecutor takes a stand. The hashtags trended relentlessly. #EqualJusticeNow. #bias in the courts. Thousands of people shared their own stories of discrimination within the justice system. As the media storm continued to swirl, Kendrick remained focused on the investigation. The evidence was damning. Over the past 5 years, Judge Whitman had imposed fines on black defendants that were 3 times higher than those on white defendants for the same infractions. Late arrivals by white defendants went unmentioned, while black defendants faced reprimands or exorbitant fines. Even requests for payment plans were more often denied to black defendants. But it wasn't just about the numbers. The testimonies came flooding in. One black mother recounted being fined $500 for contesting a zoning issue, despite having clear evidence the city was at fault. Another young man shared how the judge had humiliated him in open court, questioning his work ethic, only to dismiss a similar case from a white defendant minutes later. The public outrage grew, and protests started popping up outside the courthouse, calling for accountability. Kendrick stayed behind the scenes, quietly consolidating evidence with the Judicial Review Commission. But the weight of the situation was undeniable. Staff who had worked under Judge Whitman for years started coming forward with their own observations. Mrs. Thompson's notebook was a key piece, and it combined with the court records to create an unshakable foundation of proof. Even James Wilson, the bailiff, spoke out publicly. "I've seen this kind of treatment for years," he said. "It's wrong, and it's time for something to change." As the days passed, Judge Whitman found himself increasingly isolated. He had dismissed the accusations as misunderstandings, but the evidence was undeniable. In a rare public statement, he expressed regret for any unintentional harm caused. But those words rang hollow in the face of overwhelming proof. For Kendrick, the pressure only intensified. But he stayed grounded. He knew his role as a federal prosecutor was larger than this case. But he also knew the fight was just beginning. He wasn't going to let the voices of the oppressed be silenced again. The movement spread far beyond Greenville. Activists in other parts of South Carolina began investigating their own court systems. The state's Judicial Oversight Committee promised a sweeping review of municipal courts. By the end of the month, the Judicial Review Commission had completed its preliminary report, and the findings were devastating. Judge Whitman's actions were just the tip of the iceberg. The report called for immediate reforms, mandatory bias training for judges, regular audits, and the creation of independent oversight committees. The pressure finally became too much for Judge Whitman. He resigned, citing the need for a fresh start for the court. The announcement was met with mixed reactions. Some saw it as an admission of guilt, while others viewed it as a necessary step toward healing. For Kendrick, it was a moment of vindication, though not one of celebration. The real work had only just begun. Reforms began to take shape. Kendrick found himself speaking at law schools, forums, and conferences, sharing his story and urging the next generation of lawyers to continue the fight for justice. His story inspired young lawyers from underrepresented backgrounds, showing them that they could make a difference. Months later, the courthouse in Greenville had been transformed. The beige walls were freshly painted, and a new welcome desk greeted visitors. Signs in multiple languages pointed the way to resources once hidden from those who needed them most: payment plans, legal aid, and guides to navigate the system. A small plaque near the entrance read, "Equal justice is everyone's right." Inside, the changes were even more profound. The old judge was gone, replaced by a younger one with a reputation for fairness and impartiality. Systemic reforms were underway, and all court personnel were now required to undergo bias training. Kendrick stood at the back of the newly renovated courtroom, watching as local judges and lawyers attended a session on the changes. He felt a mixture of pride and cautious optimism. The road to justice was long, but they had taken the first step. And he knew that with every person who spoke up, they were making the system better.